Welcome to Artistic Synergy of Baltimore's More Than a Moment series event, Race in America, the Prologue. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I am your host and director of the event, Lydia West. We started this series because we felt as a culturally and gender diverse theater group with the motto, Theater for Everyone, to continue the important dialogues that were reignited, not just in this country, but globally during 2020. Tonight's event is subtitled The Prologue because we are merely scratching the surface of this discussion, and we will introduce the cultural and ethnic experiences in America that we would like to continue in other events. And we wanted to speak to not just the African American versus white American tensions, but also to those of Jewish, Latinx, Native American, and Asian American cultures in our country. Our panel of experts who have so graciously given their time tonight will then answer your questions and address your thoughts during these special sessions. To begin our first Q&A session this evening, I'd like to thank Amy and Rob Tucker, both Maryland-based theater actors and educators, for their interpretations of those anonymously submitted thoughts and questions. Now to introduce our panelists. As I call you by name, please turn on your video. Dr. Angela Courage is an adjunct professor at multiple universities and CEO of Courage Communication for Change, Seeing Color with 2 R's, both of which serve her mission to, quote, lead healthy conversations that empower people to communicate and connect with diverse others. Mr. John Gritz is an enrolled member of the Cherokee Nation who has worked with tribal colleges throughout his career in higher education at Black Hills State University, the American Indian College Fund, the Institute of American Indian Arts, as well as with the Department of Education. Dr. Liz Johnson is senior lecturer at University of North Carolina, Charlotte. Her teaching focus is ethics, and one of her research foci is diversity and inclusion. Ms. Tasneem Noor is founder and CEO of Noor Enterprises, Soulful Transformations, and author of The Faith Connection, and has been conducting her web series, Courageous Conversations, which continues important discussions since the death of George Floyd. She is an interfaith minister in residence with the Episcopalian Diocese and programs director for New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish partnership for change. And lastly, Ms. Lauren Tillman. She is principal of an elementary school within one of the most diverse counties in Maryland and is a member of BCPS Connects, which serves to further equity discussions within a school system currently serving 115,000 students. Welcome, and thank you all again for joining us this evening. So let's get to these questions and thoughts. For the Lorna de Cervantes piece, Poem to a Young White Man, the story about her is clear, stirring and painfully touching. The poet is the same. Without the story, the poem could be from any race other than white in America. How do you see the poem reflecting on feminism or Chicano suppression specifically? And how about we start with Dr. Johnson?
Okay, good question. When I think about oppression and when I think about color, I look at the statistics, at least for females, that again, these may have changed, every 10 seconds, someone's a victim of domestic violence, and then someone's raped every 12 seconds, a female. So I look in terms of safety, and then add that the challenges, whether you're rural or from the city or maybe Latina, so those are the contexts that are the filters that, again, I want to question and see how we can move through those, or at least provide a different context.
Thank you. Let's move to Lauren.
Good evening. I think what comes to mind for me is that, and it's interesting that Liz mentioned safety, because for me, as an African-American female, I think safety looks probably different than what Karen's safety looks like. And I think, but she's absolutely correct in terms of feminine safety. Now, that's been something that hadn't been really on the forefront for a while. And then race became part of that conversation. So when we think about Me Too movement, it didn't belong to everybody. It wasn't everyone's movement. And so I think that for me, my safety looks very different than as a person of color, as a female and a person of color. So that's been where my mind has been sitting recently.
Okay, thank you. I do want to get the male perspective on this. So before moving to Doc Courage and ending with Tasneem, John, did you have any thoughts about this?
Well, yeah, based on what Liz and Lauren have said, the issue of the murdered Indigenous women comes to mind. And that's something that's not recognized. It's just becoming recognized, that this gap between where we live and safety is important, yet, safety is usually at our home. But for the Native women, sometimes it's not safe at home. And so it's unrecognized. So that's what I thought of when the two comments were made.
Thank you. Doc Courage.
Well, I think both oppression and safety come in layers. And if you're missing a layer, it makes you more vulnerable to oppression. Or the more layers you have, the less vulnerable you are. And those layers look like, race is one very protective or unprotected layer. Gender is another one. Socioeconomic status. So there's multiple layers that make us either more insulated or more vulnerable to oppression.
Thank you. Tasneem.
So I'm Muslim, and when I think of it, there was this line of I'm marked by the color of my skin. And so when I think of Muslim women like myself, I don't cover my head. So there's a choice, right? I'm not marked by it. I can pass by and people may or may not know I'm Muslim. But in my own household, my sister, she covers her head, and for her, it's not a choice. For her, it's non-negotiable. And so when she leaves the house, she is a Muslim woman, visibly so. And that has repercussions based on where you're going and how to navigate through, all of it to be safe. So I think the safety question was definitely very prominent for me.
Yeah. Thank you. And yes, the thought of being, while many of us in this country right now have a greater hope of less fear when we leave our homes, under the current U.S. administration, we know that just because things change at the head of a country doesn't necessarily mean that the attitudes of people change completely. So speaking to that, when I opted to perform this piece myself, it was because all of the words touched me. I read it, even though it was by a Latinx woman, I felt it in me. And this poem was actually written in 1981. It could have been written today.
Okay.
She could have written it 5 minutes ago. It was unbelievable how familiar it felt 40 years hence. And it was also saddening to me. And actually, I took a liberty and added a line that they are aiming at my son, because I fear for my son every time he leaves the house. He's 16, and I have to give my son a speech. And that is, so fear is one of the things that that is one of those scars to me that she talks about in the poem. And so can I maybe get some of your thoughts on the first piece? We did put out a poll and asked for submissions and thoughts to be sent.
Mhm.
And these are real thoughts and real feelings of our fellow white Americans. I don't know if any of you noted some of them. I mean, the question of how can there still be racism if we had a Black president and now a Black vice president, a Black and East Indian vice president.
Mhm.
Would anyone like to start? I will leave that open to you guys. Yes, Mr. Dr. Johnson.
I think the problem comes in specifically, again, some part of my background is in philosophy of language. So I think the challenge is in what specifically we mean by racism, to what degree, to what point, in what context, because even President Trump had African Americans on his staff and stuff like that. But then there were other behaviors that indicated that he wasn't supportive of different racial groups. So I find it challenging to work in this area because we don't have a uniform definition of what racism is. And then you take that and it means something different to everybody else, filtered through their different contexts and their different experiences.
Thank you. Yes, Lauren.
And I think that my opinion of it is probably a little bit different, in that I think that even if now, like you mentioned, Lydia, was that the poem that had been read could be today. I think that we're fortunate in society today, if anything, is that we're more aware than we were. And we also have a very revolutionary culture. So we're fortunate for that. But I think I might have to push back a little bit on the fact that I think everyone is very clear on what racism looks like. I think everyone is very clear of what racism looks like and the impact that it has on who. I think, I don't particularly like to bring politics into anything, because I think that this was far before politics, right? Politics made it complicated. But I think the semblance of racism and who racism is about, and who racism is targeted, is very clear. I think what happens is we tend to detour. Gorski talks about the avoiding equity detours. Well, one of the detours is saying that I don't understand what racism is. I don't understand I don't know how it gets conflicted. We have a Black president. I don't understand why we have racism in America. That's starting to sound foolish. That's starting to sound really foolish now, just because we've had opportunities to make great leaders out of many of our students. I know myself, as an educator first, as the daughter of educators, I learned very early that students of color are always considered to be a second-class citizen and have had to move that way through their educational system. And so as a principal now, that's something that I insist our staff see first when we talk about student groups. And so, not to go on and take up space, but I just think that I have to kind of push back on the racism is confusing. I think that that's starting to become a detour of it.
Thank you. Tasneem, you look like you have a thought.
I do. I think what I loved the most about that piece, and the part that troubled me the most, was the same thing that I've heard almost all of those being said out loud, and I feel the sincerity in them too. And one that I not struggle with, but try to do more work with, is the one where they said, like, how come swapping stories? That was me trying to relate. How can that be racist, or how can that be bad? And I think what often is missing when that happens are two things. One, it comes in as oh, me too, as if it's exactly the same. And that part can feel dismissive. And the second part is that if you relate without acknowledging first, acknowledging what you have heard, acknowledging the person in front of you, then it can also feel like, oh, let me just tell you what I have to say or what happened to me. So I think in communications and just my experiences, it's so important to really name and to just acknowledge the person and not just be caught up with the points all the time.
Thank you. John?
Yeah, I think it's hard sometimes because when you're in a leadership role, when you're in a position where you're making decisions or whether just you're visible, for me, I get all those dumb questions, and I hate to say they're dumb, but let me rephrase that. I get all those questions. I think that, like you said, they are sincere, but they don't know how to ask the question without being offensive. And I don't get mad. I don't get upset. I just kind of step back and say, okay, where's this coming from? And what are they asking me? And how do I need to answer that? And if there is an answer. And especially with Native people, because we're so underrepresented and we're just not in mainstream, if you will. There's a few, but one of the classic things that I used to get when I worked for the American Indian College Fund is being out there in that world, and people come up and say, "Are you a real Indian? Like, what else am I?" But again, you have to learn how to put that back or rephrase it, if you will. So it's a sticky point, no matter who you are.
Thank you. Before moving on to our next question, Doc Courage, did you have a thought on this, or?
Yes, I do have a thought. I think even this discussion is an example of how people from different ethnic and or other cultural groups can misunderstand what the other person is saying based on the way we use words. There's plenty of cultural research that supports this, and intercultural communication research specifically. And lately, in the last few years, interracial communication has really been focused on out of the intercultural research. And so, for example, let's just talk about the word justice. Often when European Americans use the word justice, the part of that word justice that they mean is vengeance or punishment, right? When people of color use the word justice, it's not as much focused on vengeance or punishment as it is on equity and restitution, right? So both of those are part of the meaning of justice, but culturally, European Americans focus on this part, and most people of color focus on the restitution part, especially Black Americans. So just in simple words, we often are even thinking and affirming the same thing, but missing each other because we're not, just because we need to clarify and make sure everybody's understanding, but it can become, it can even become contentious when you're trying to understand.
Absolutely. I was going to ask a follow-up to that, but in lieu of time, I want to get to one of our audience members' questions. So to the panel, if you are not in the target group, what are ways that you can speak up for others? Liz, do you have a thought?
Yeah, I'll be glad to. I work in computer science, so one of the areas, that's where I teach, one of the areas my concern is with AI and machine learning and these algorithms and how we create bias in those algorithms. And you have the future of technology and maybe even the planet is based on a lot of this technology. So what I attempt to do is talk about as many different ideas, phases, impacts, about differences, how we can see it from all these different lenses, and then how can we prevent it as far as being institutionalized or just being perpetuated through these algorithms that make decisions for us every day.
Okay, thank you.
I'd say the simplest thing is to tell stories, to really humanize the experience of the target, the person that targeted. I know it opens my heart, and it really helps to make the other less of a suspected or mysterious kind of an entity, and just turn them into a human being with an experience that is now relatable at whatever level.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that question before we move on? Lauren?
I was going to mention that is something I think the question harbors a little bit towards allyship, and having that conversation around what an ally should look like and what is determined by. I think one of the things that I have seen as been authentic in terms of allyship as a person of color is not resisting this conversation. I think part of it is starting with having the conversation, but also recognizing that action comes with that. It also has a component of what you're willing to risk when you're in that action space. So you're willing to have the conversations, you're willing to go to all the meetings you need to go to, and you're not resisting, but then there's got to be movement. There's got to be something that you're willing to risk, because what we know is that systems and structures make things happen beyond and behind the scenes of things for people of color. And if we are not in allyship in action, then we're really just in conversation. And we've just been in conversation for a long time. And I know that the profession that I'm in, our kids are hurting because of it. Students of color are hurting because we are sitting in a place of conversation, and people are wondering what their action is going to be or what they'll lose if they engage. So I there's a young lady on this call, Lisa Norton, she says all the time, it's like, move out of the way. Like, if it's not something that you're comfortable with, then you've got to get with me and I will help move the work, and I bring you with me. So I just think that that's one of the things that we have to think about when we think about allyship too.
I think that's a great segue into the next very real question that we have from an audience member. Why is it the job of people of color to coddle, wet nurse white folks who are just now becoming mildly conscious of systemic and structural racism? So we want to have the conversation, but at the same time, we've been having the conversation for a long time. The action, but then it seems to be our job to then pull them along.
Right.
Can I get your thoughts on that? Why is it our job? Does it remain our job?
Oh, no. And I think that when we talk about risk, risk is what we start to think about, job interviews, for example. If I'm going up against another person that's not a person of color, is there going to be more behind what I bring to the table for the job than someone else? But is there anybody on that panel that I'm interviewing in front of that's willing to say, I want to take a risk on her, or I want to take, our company needs to be more diverse. That's just one of the examples, that I think about. But it's doing and it's speaking up, but it can't be just one race or gender group, subgroup. It can't be that way. It's a lot. It's a lot for one.
I wholeheartedly agree. Do we have any other thoughts on that? We are running a little low on time, but go ahead, John.
Well, sometimes we're putting a position where we're representing everybody within who we are. And that becomes difficult because it depends on where you're at, what the circumstances are, those types of things. But we're just, for lack of a better word, we're pigeonholed into places sometimes where we're backed into a corner. And you are responding for all Native Americans or all whomever we are. So that becomes difficult at times.
Thank you, John. I will read one thought that is in our our comments. The fact that we can speak to one Black president and one Black and Asian VP is indicative of racism. It's not a semantics or philosophical pondering. We do have one more question that I will ask. Would it be safe to say that white Americans have the convenience to be ignorant to all or most matters of race?
Say it again, please.
Would it be safe to say that white Americans have the convenience to be ignorant to all or most matters of race? Dr. Courage.
I would say yes, absolutely. Some of the social sciences call that privilege, white privilege specifically. If I'm understanding the nuances of the question, if you don't experience racism, if you don't experience sexism, then you don't have to pay attention to it, right? And I'm not saying that's the way it should be. That's why white Americans do not typically attend to it or haven't historically. But this also connects back to the last question about allyship and kind of wet nursing white people to be able to be an ally. There's got to be an entry point, and for most people, the entry point is relationships. It's relationship, but that can be extremely taxing. If you just look at the population, 13% African American, maybe 14% overall in the United States, 13 or 14% Latinos, Latinx. I don't remember what the demographic for Asian Americans or Muslims or First Nations people, but if what historically has been an overwhelming majority of white people are all taxing their one Black friend, which is a misnomer in itself, right? Then that's on top of their day job, then it's exhausting, it's impossible, and frankly, a lot of times that person isn't ready to really get nursed because they're not getting any of their own information. In this day and time, you can get your own information. There's plenty of books out. There are plenty of groups to follow, and just listen and be quiet. So so enter the conversation because of a friend, because you see there's a problem, but then don't drain that friend or every person of color you see to educate you. All of us have paid for our education, so the least you can do as another white person, I say this, is buy a book, buy a book.
Thank you, Dr. Courage. Tasneem?
Yeah, I'll just add that if you are part of a group that has power and is part of the majority, you have privilege. You have that convenience of not asking questions. It's as simple as that. And I think in today's world and context, the word privilege has almost become like an insult. What do you mean I'm privileged? Don't you see all the struggles that I have? But I'm humbled by the privilege that I have. I feel responsible because of the privilege that I have. So I'll just say, as a Muslim again, being in America, I'm part of a minority and definitely not privileged, but being part of the Sunni sect of the Muslim community, which is like 90% plus Muslim is the Sunni sect, I have a lot of privilege. There are a lot of stories and pains of my Shia brothers and sisters that I didn't even know about until I started talking to them and listening to them. And so most of us have privilege in some area or aspect of our life. And to me, I look for it so I can make sure I'm doing my part responsibly.
Thank you all. So to continue some of the questions that our audience members have asked, especially with these two pieces that bring, as part of Fires in the Mirror, that bring a balance to the Black and Jewish dialogue that has been longstanding, not just in New York, but We also face some of it here in Baltimore and in other parts of the country. With that in mind, how can a person not be affected by an ism? That is a question that was posed in our chat. And we know that Black people have faced racism toward them, and then the Jewish have had racism. They suffer from racism in this country as well, not just from this dialogue with each other, but from outside forces. And so, piggybacking on our conversations from before these pieces, how can anyone not be affected by an ism, even when it seems like one group has more an advantage than another? Lauren?
Sorry, talking to my son running around. I think that one thing, when we think about history, we all have a semblance of revisionist history. But at the same time, going through the stages of what that revisionist history often can cause. From what I heard, even in the last piece, was that, someone being sent to the hospital and someone being ignored was a little bit triggering, just because that's something that has been very common. So I sort of am in thought process around that question a little bit more. Mm-hmm.
Did anyone else want to chime in? Okay, Dr. Johnson.
Yeah, what I thought was absolutely striking was when Dr. Jeffrey said, "Acknowledge me." I mean, that's to me what both characters were saying. And it really made me think, how should we acknowledge that me, wherever that me is, whoever that person is, wherever they're coming from. So again, how do we acknowledge? And then it gets to the point, how should we? And then if the dominant culture decides how we should acknowledge, and that just repeats that cycle. So how do we move beyond the cultural privilege of who should or how we should be doing this to something that, again, I guess is more inclusive, or that's more genuine, or maybe more real in the real world?
Tasneem?
Yeah. I don't know if there's anyone who's Jewish on this panel, and if so, please forgive me, and I value whatever you have to say. But as someone who's invested a lot in Muslim-Jewish dialogue and is part of these conversations a lot and has spoken to a lot of Jewish folks, and just earlier this week, I've been part of a lot of these conversations of Jews struggling with having two identities, one of benefiting from the whiteness, and these are Ashkenazi Jews, not all Jews are white, but a lot of them are. And so at one point struggling with the whiteness because they recognize the privileges that they get because of it, while still struggling with their Jewish identity and how the two come together. And just acknowledging that it is complicated and complex for them to navigate through those. And then I'm sure, just like any other community, there are some Jews who are not as aware of it, or are not thinking about it as much. I know that's true. I was just saying it's true in my experiences. But I think one more thing I want to raise from it, again, from the conversations that I've had, that experience or story touched upon the experience of an Orthodox or a Shabbos observant Jewish. And I've spoken to other Jews who are not as Shabbos observant, and their experience with this navigation is also fascinating and subtle and complex. So I just wanted to bring that I don't think I answered the question directly. I think whether you are part of an ism identity or not, everyone is affected by isms. And so for me, I don't know how else to respond to that question.
No, that's fine. As the parent of a student who my son is obviously of color, and he attends a school that was established by non-secular Jews over 100 years ago. And while the vast majority of his school are white and not necessarily Jewish, but those tensions that seemed like they were quelled certainly came up after George Floyd's death, when the Black Lives Matter movement, was reignited. The head of the school was amazing in his eloquence and how he expressed the feelings really of all of the administration in the school was one of support for the movement. However, in the very frank discussions that followed, the minority students certainly seem to still feel this very familiar discussion brewing with other Jewish American students and their parents, an attitude that needed to be addressed. And so thankfully now discussions are being held all the time to figure out how to deal with both sides of the story. And so when we see these things trickle down, it helps. It actually brings me to another question that is in our chat, which is that white people have made it a point to pervert, distort, and destroy African history while at the same time profiting off of it. The folks at my son's school don't always understand that there's a mistrust. There's a distrust for all peoples who are not of color, who they perceive are not of color. And sometimes I feel like that Jewish diaspora is not acknowledged as one of color, but simply one of privilege. And then so that dichotomy and that tension remains. In the story, not the story, but in the recounting of that Roots piece, Roots happened to have premiered 43 years ago today. That is part of the story. A Jewish American or a person of Jewish descent in Lauren Green kind of takes that story and perverts, distorts, and destroys part of African history in the retelling of Roots. So how do we, I think for me, it's how do we kind of heal that or start that conversation for healing between those two diasporas? Well, that is kind of a heavy question. I'll let you guys think about it. Or Tasneem?
I mean, my answer might be too simplistic, but that is where I would start, which is with acknowledgement again. I think the Jewish, so I'll share an experience when now I'm on staff for New Ground and I facilitate their programs. But 10 years ago, when I joined their program as a participant, there were 10 Jews and 10 Muslims, and we were there for a 9-month program to get to know one another. And in my cohort of 10 Jews, there was someone who identified as being an Orthodox Jew, someone who identified as being an atheist Jew, And I, as a Muslim, was like, what? And then like, I had no idea that Judaism was not always a religious identity. It's a racial, ethnic, religious, all of those things. And then I had a rabbi come in to our program. And one thing he said is, this is a rabbi and a professor, like a doctor, right? And he's like, there's no one definition of a Jew. I can't tell you who a Jew is. And then he went through all these different things that make the Jewish experience a Jew, And so point being that when we are having these conversations of differences, it's important to acknowledge the nuances, because when we don't, then it's either assumed that it's being dismissed or misunderstood, or it just creates more space for misunderstandings. And so when I hear a Black person say, just reparations or that conversation, what I'm also hearing is just acknowledge my history, acknowledge my pain, acknowledge my struggle. Like there's that, we have to start with that humanization, before we can get to the next level of policy or whatnot. And of course, I also relate to what Lauren was saying earlier, that it can't just be conversation. Conversation with action is super duper important. And, conversation without acknowledgement is also, or action without acknowledgement can also go in not effective directions. So, yeah.
Thank you. I'm just going to look really quickly at the chat here. And we have, okay. So I have a question that is not specifically to these two pieces. Do white people really want to deconstruct and dismantle white supremacy culture, especially because it benefits them? That is, sorry, and it said would love an honest answer. So I'll repeat the question. Do white people really want to deconstruct and dismantle white supremacy culture, especially because it benefits them? I know it's a
tricky question, and I think that it also wraps itself around what I stated before about what you're willing to risk. Not so much the dismantling of something; it's allowing people, whoever that may be, to stay in their comfort. And if their comfort has been to be in one group and live that way, then that's we're not willing to risk and give that up. And so, we're going to try to dismantle what we can, hope somebody else dismantles it, all that verbiage. But I think it goes right back to what I said about, what you're willing to, well, how can I be an ally? How, we'll recognize those parts of white supremacy culture that exist within yourself and with others, and how you dismantle that in your own space. I think the question also becomes, what are we willing to talk about in our own homes? What are we willing to say that when we go to, holiday dinners, and we know that you're hearing some things that are a little bit dicey, that we just sort of accept and just say, well, that's Uncle Bill. He talks like that. No, Uncle Bill ain't supposed to talk like that. But what do? We let that continue. We don't interrupt. So I think that's quite possible. I can't speak for any races, whether or not they want to dismantle anything. I just know they haven't tried to yet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Doc, Courage?
Well, according to a statistic I was hearing last week after the inauguration, for the inauguration, anyway, sometime in the last week, we know that about 35% of the Republican Party have been loyalists to a white supremacist president. I hope that's not offensive to anyone, but it is what it is. And so we know that at least 35% of at least that segment of the population has no interest or desire to dismantle white supremacy. Well, that leaves the rest of us, and so I think that there are a significant number of people that would like to dismantle white supremacy that often don't feel equipped. And one thing that I often, the analogy I often make is that, people of color in the United States have grown up having conversations about race at the dinner table and their experiences at the dinner table and in the home. And so people of color in the United States, I mean, they're like PhDs on the conversation. And white people have often not grown up having these conversations. And so often when we come to the conversation, we're coming to it like third graders. And so, we lack language, we lack accurate historical information. And so I think people can mistake discomfort for oppression, and so it's so uncomfortable. And so we can be so inept at it that a lot of times people who have an interest or a conscience about it will just kind of hang out in spaces where they can learn for quite a while before they start speaking to it, because not just because of the discomfort, but because there's a learning curve that we have to make up, because we've been, our educations haven't been giving us this accurate. I'm 56. I know my generation and the years in school, very little information about any history other than white history. And so there's a lot of catching up to do when someone recognizes that there actually is a problem with white supremacy in this country.
Thank you. Why, going back to a couple of these questions, and I feel like this particular question lends itself especially to our Latinx fellow Americans. Why do we say that when it comes to POCs and hiring, it's taking a risk? Isn't that a microaggression that we as people of color need to stop saying?
I think my question was microaggression to whom? Like, who would the microaggression be towards? Because I think if I was to answer the question unknowing, I would say historically and data-wise, find the lie. Like, find where that doesn't often happen too much to people of color. So I guess I'm unsure of what they mean by the microaggression on our behalf or a microaggression towards us. So I guess I'm unclear about the question.
Well, my interpretation would be that the microaggression is toward us as persons of color, that saying that it is a risk to hire a person of color. I don't even understand how that's a microaggression, actually.
Right. But it happens, right? Like it happens. So I'll just leave it there.
It does, and unless someone wanted to hop in, go ahead, John.
Well, I was just thinking what Lauren said. I think when you're the one who's in power, or you're the one who's hiring, you have to be careful with that, because you're going to get pigeonholed as being that. I really like the piece that this young man did for us. I just like both of those pieces he did. But when he said God bless America, all of a sudden we're America. When we're in charge, Lauren. And I was in charge of people too as well when I was at Black Hill State. And I just remember people not knowing Grits is not a common South Dakota name. It's not a Lakota name. It's a good Cherokee name. And when people would come into the office, in the financial aid office, and see this big, tall Indian guy with a long ponytail, they just couldn't fathom that I was in charge of that whole office. And they would call me and ream me out sometimes about their experiences with Native people. And I'd say, well, come in and I'll explain it to you. I'll be more than happy. And I didn't get mad at them. You got to educate people sometimes. And when they walked in the door and saw who I was, their mouths just dropped. And, and they started apologizing for what they said over the phone, not knowing who I was. So you have to take that in terms of you can educate somebody too when you're in a person of color in power. And I took that role seriously. And I tried to do that with my students, with the families I met and everything like that. And I just think, anyway, that's what I thought. That was going on. I mumbled at the end, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry? No, you're fine. No, thank you. And going to your point of, well, I should say, another one that came up to me as you mentioned that it doesn't sound like after their rant on the phone, they were expecting to see someone who looked like you when they walked in. And that is another microaggression in itself. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize who I was talking to on the phone because you don't sound the way I thought you would sound. So that's just something that those are microaggressions that we deal with all the time. I will move on to another question unless Dr. Johnson, Dr. Courage, or Tasneem had a thought on that. Okay. Let's see, we talked about supremacy. We will go on.
I did have one thought on it.
Go for it. Thank you.
The perception that it's a risk to hire a person of color. I mean, I would hope I would never interview a person of color who would say, take a risk on me and hire me, because that would reinforce the internal bias that's in a lot of organizations. Most organizations we know at most levels in society are, predominantly white male run decision makers, but so the system that's in place in those organizations might perceive it as a risk, because we've seen this in some EEOC stuff. It's a person may not be perceived to be a good fit because the powers that be are uncomfortable and don't know the answer to all these questions that we started with, so they don't realize that they're the problem because they're uncomfortable, they're uninformed, they're uneducated, and that gets projected onto the person of color. So internally, yeah, it can be perceived as a risk, even if I, the hiring manager, am convinced this is our person. This person is the best for the job. Every hiring manager is going to also get pressure from the rest of the organization, the organizational culture. And the person hired may not get support. So from that aspect, the perception of a risk is real, but the greatest risk is to the person who gets hired into that kind of organization.
Well, and piggybacking on that, one of the questions that was asked, and I was actually trying to find a good time to ask that, because we tend to give things other names to make it more palatable to hear. And so you use the term powers that be in an organization. The question that is posed is, white culture is what you meant by dominant culture, right? So I feel like there is a need to that there needs to be a push to call it what it is. And so since we did want to have kind of a frank conversation, we if the person's in position of power, or if the dominant culture that we're talking about is the white culture, I feel like it might be important to use that term, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all persons in that culture, or every person in the white culture is all the same, because obviously our European Americans have come from all kinds of backgrounds, but they are the dominant culture here. So I wanted to address that. If anybody has a thought on that, you're certainly welcome to talk about it as well. Okay, so going back to, and I love these pieces. Well, I'm trying to catch up on some of these questions, but I love those two pieces, as John mentioned that he did as well, because to me, they really reflect the plight of the Puerto Ricans in America, but not just Puerto Ricans or those in the Latinx culture, but any minorities who are trying to find their place, not just in the community, but also working. So that one is really a flashback to the other ones, but I will ask this one. Going back to our Black and Jewish dialogue, I feel like this one is important, and I missed it before we moved on. Why is there that conflict between the Black community and Jewish community in America, when both groups have been targeted with bigotry and discrimination, of course, in different ways? Is it because being Jewish is an ethno-religion and not a race, and therefore having the privilege to hide specifically white Jewish Americans? Does anyone feel like they have the
I have a little historic insight on it, but somebody else may have more appropriate information than I do. In communication research, one of the things that we know, if we look at the different ethnic groups and their immigration into the United States, forced or voluntary, we know that most Jewish people came to the United States voluntarily. And obviously most African Americans now didn't. But when Jewish people came to the United States, they were considered Black. And so the root of all conflicts between any ethnic group is really the heart of white supremacy. And so originally Jewish people were categorized as Black. I don't remember the year of the census where it changed, but so some of the research I've read is that then it kind of pitted Jewish people against Black people trying to get out of the one drop rule laws and the 3/5 where they were perceived and could easily be treated the same as a person of African descent when they're categorized as Black. And I think it was in the 1800s. Italians were as well originally when they came. So I think it was in the 1800s that changed. And so that's part of the historic and the conflict that was from the beginning of when most Jewish people immigrated is, are we going to treat them like they're Black or not? And of course, Black people, there was no question. So, I'm not saying any of that's right. I'm just saying that that's what the historic context is. And then when in the media and in the entertainment industry, minstrel shows, blackface, a lot of times before Black people were allowed to be actors in the entertainment industry, a lot of Jewish people were the actors that did blackface. So there's some historical tension there that really is caused by white supremacy and trying to get away from the treatment of the one drop rule.
I definitely don't know the history, so thank you, Doc Courage, for even the little bit that you shared. What I just was reminded of was in the recent since Charlottesville, it's been really, they will not replace us. That kind of rhetoric has been thrown around quite a bit. And so from my perspective, I was trying to understand white supremacy and the dominant culture and all of this. Like, okay, maybe they just don't like people who are people of color. Okay, maybe they just don't like people who are of a different religion, but I think it's anybody who's different than their own, whatever their own little circle is the other. And then the others are kind of pitted against each other in that sense. So that's my very broad, basic understanding. But the other thing that I also wanted to say and just name, I don't think anyone has challenged this, but I just wanted to explicitly say that anti-Semitism is real. And just like Asians are often seen as the model minority, and given as the example of minorities who went through whatever, and now look at them, the doctors and this and that, I think Jewish community has a similar, are portrayed in a similar way, where they have me, I'll just again speak for myself as a Muslim, I look up to the Jewish community and was like, whoa, you guys have made a lot of advancement and have a lot to learn from you. And I come at it from that perspective. And so again, going back to a previous thing, if you don't understand the history, anti-Semitism gets lost in a lot of this conversation because they have made advancements. But that they weren't chanting, I'm sure they feel this way, but in Charlottesville, they weren't chanting, Muslims will not replace Christians. They were chanting, they will not, like Jews will not replace us. So it just speaks to the deep embedded, like, I don't understand it, but anti-Semitism is that kind of a thing that gets hidden and then just pops up somewhere. And because a lot of, not, again, there are Ashkenazi Jews and there is the white skin, they can get lost, whereas the Blacks, they cannot hide their skin color. So, I think those are some of the things.
Thank you. So for Cherokee Night, we have a question. I once saw August Osage County, my only reference for Osage, done by a completely Black cast. It wasn't until after seeing it that I learned that it was originally about a white family. My point being, the issues raised were not color-based, but family-based, so the story could truly be done by anyone, anywhere. I felt the same reading and hearing this. The terms used reflected tribe-based and education-based prejudice, but with the exchange of references, this could be about several races and families. When you read it as an American Indian, how did it hit you differently than it hit me, if it did? So I think this question was really geared toward John.
There, I did it wrong. There's a lot to that particular question and a lot to what that segment was about. First of all, you have to know the history of the Osage and the Cherokee. When the Cherokee were removed on the Trail of Tears from their homelands in the southeast, they made the Osage move over because the white man gave us the Osage land. So there's always been that conflict of where is our land? Our land, our Cherokee land is back east. That's Osage land. So there's always been that conflict between them as well. And the play August Osage County, I got to watch KJ in that one as well too. And my wife and I watched that one and when it was on Broadway as well. And yeah, it was about a white family, but there was always conflict in that particular as well. And I think one of the stars was the Indian actress that played in both those plays. because it just brought it all, it grounded it all. And again, there's so much to that. I could say a million things about what that play was about or what it means or what it says or anything like that. But those actors did a great job, I thought.
Thank you. This question is for all. Do you feel, actually, no, for Don. Do you still see this level of tribe and education prejudice in the American Indian community?
Little history lesson first. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes in this country. How many people know that? There are 5.6 million Native Americans right now in this country. Of those, 70% don't live on a reservation. So only 30% of the people live on a reservation. Yet we all think that every Indian lives on a reservation, if you will. There used to be a lot of conflict between the tribes. The tribes, they didn't fight over the land. They just fought over the resources, if you will. I don't think they fought. It wasn't really fighting, if you will. It was just, we need this resource for our people to sustain or survive. The other thing that comes to play in my mind is our Constitution. It was taken in context with the Iroquois Confederacy. And when you look at how there was an elder who was the president, if you will. He led them. The Senate was the other elder men who were wise and had lived their life. The House of Representatives was the young warriors. So there was always that conflict of the young and the old, not the conflict, but there was a balance. But what they left out of the Constitution that our country now uses, the Supreme Court, was the women. It was all women. They made the final decision of they moved, if they went to battle, whatever happened. So the women played an important role in that. And I wish that was happening now, because maybe our country would be different if we would listen to the women, because the women, they gave birth. Everything about the women was strong and important. And I've forgotten the question. I got a bunch of notes here I made before this question, but ask me again.
The question was, do you still see this level of tribe and education prejudice in the American Indian community?
No, not like that was portrayed there. Education is so important that I'm an elder. I'm 73 years old, so I've lived through many different parts of what that play was about. And there was a time that we had, I don't say conflict, but we would tease each other about being Cherokee or being Crow or being Lakota or whatever that tribe happened to be. But we also shared stories about who we were from. When I went to the art school in Santa Fe, it opened my eyes to the world of what native other tribes are about. When I was growing up, I knew about the 5 civilized tribes. I knew about the Lakota and I knew about the Navajo. But my first roommates were Seneca, Zuni, and Oneida. And I'd never heard of those tribes. Yeah, when we met, then we melded, we got together, we learned from each other. We learned about the different cultures that we represented and where we were from. And the other part of that is living off the reservation too. Yeah, there is conflict, but not like it used to be or what it is now. Now we try and unite and form some unions, if you will, or some type of getting together so that we're all coming from the same spot.
Thank you. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for such frank discussions. And I've been, I had a chance to finally catch up on the conversations that were happening in the chat. And I appreciate that dialogue. I appreciate our panelists answering those thoughts and questions within the chat. I would like to acknowledge and pay some homage to our National Poet Laureate, Youth Poet Laureate, who just captured all of our hearts on Wednesday, Amanda Gorman. I just wanted to be part of that poem that really struck me for this conversation. She said, "For while we have eyes on the future, history has its eyes on us. This is the era of just redemption. We feared at its inception. We did not feel prepared to be the heirs of such a terrifying hour, but within it we found the power to author a new chapter, to offer hope and laughter to ourselves. So while once we asked, how could we possibly prevail over catastrophe? Now we assert, how could catastrophe possibly prevail over us? And so with those closing thoughts, I would like to highly encourage that all of us continue this conversation. First off, I want to thank our panelists. Oh my goodness. Thank you all. This was amazing. This was everything that we hoped it would be. And we want to encourage others to continue the conversations that have been started on our new Facebook page. And oh my goodness, why have I lost the name of that Facebook page? But it's the Artistic Synergy of Baltimore Dialogue for Change Facebook page. And where we have actually broken it down into different discussions. And I hope all of you will find it on Facebook. I think we can put the link in our chat so that everyone will see it. But again, thank you so much for joining us all this evening. I bid you all a good night.